If you've ever felt like you're giving everything in a relationship and still ending up drained, disrespected, or overlooked, then stay with me, because today we're breaking down exactly how women exploit men who don't know their value. This isn't about blame, it's about awareness. When a man doesn't understand his worth, he becomes vulnerable to emotional games, manipulation, and one-sided dynamics he didn't even see coming. And once you understand why this happens, you'll never fall into those traps again. When a man doesn't understand his own value, he unconsciously broadcasts it through everything he does. His body language, the way he communicates, the effort he puts in without reciprocation, and the boundaries he fails to set. Low self-worth isn't always loud or obvious. It often shows up silently through behaviors like over-apologizing, accepting disrespect, being overly available, or trying to earn love through effort instead of presence. And this is exactly where exploitation begins. Because in relationships, people respond not just to what you say, but to what you believe about yourself. If you believe you're not enough, you will attract someone who treats you like you're not enough. That's how low self-worth turns a man into an easy target without him even realizing it. A man who doesn't know his value tends to overinvest emotionally, even when the relationship doesn't require that level of investment. He feels he has to work harder to be chosen, harder to be appreciated, and harder to be seen. This creates a dynamic where he constantly gives, hoping the giving itself will create love or loyalty. But the truth is, the more he gives without balance, the more he communicates he has no standards for himself. Some women notice this pattern instantly. They see the imbalance. They see how eager he is to please. And instead of respecting it, they use it to their advantage. They take without giving. They demand attention without offering emotional depth. They expect commitment without providing clarity. It's not always malicious. It's simply human nature to take what's offered freely, especially when it comes without boundaries. Low self-worth also shows up in the way he tolerates things he shouldn't. When a woman tests a boundary by being inconsistent, disrespectful, emotionally unavailable, or manipulative, a man who knows his value responds with clarity. He addresses it or steps back, but a man who questions his worth does the opposite. He justifies her behavior. He blames himself. He tolerates emotional chaos because he fears that speaking up will push her away. And this is where exploitation deepens. The moment a woman realizes she can cross lines with no consequences, the relationship shifts from partnership to power imbalance. She becomes the one calling the shots, and he becomes the one accommodating everything to keep the connection alive. What most men don't realize is that women are extremely intuitive in relationships. They sense insecurity long before it's spoken. They notice when a man has difficulty saying no, when he shrinks himself to avoid conflict, when he puts her needs so high above his own that he disappears in the process. And once a woman realizes she can get maximum emotional or practical benefit with minimal effort, she may slip into patterns of using him without even thinking about the emotional toll it takes on him. This doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from habit, convenience, or a lack of accountability that he allowed through silence. Another way low self-worth makes a man vulnerable is through his fear of being alone. When a man believes he doesn't deserve better, he clings to relationships that drain him. He stays even when the signs of exploitation are obvious. He convinces himself that this is the best he'll get, so he endures behavior that slowly destroys his confidence. Women who thrive on control can sense this fear instantly. They use emotional withdrawal, selective affection, inconsistent communication, and guilt tactics to keep him in a constant state of anxiety and need. The weaker he feels, the stronger their influence becomes, and because he doesn't see his own value, he mistakes manipulation for love, inconsistency for mystery, and emotional dependency for connection. In reality, the core issue isn't the woman's actions, it's his lack of self-recognition. When a man doesn't see his own worth, he invites relationships that reflect that belief. A man who values himself sets the tone for how he should be treated, but a man who doubts himself allows others to define his value for him. Overgiving is one of the most common ways men unknowingly open the door to emotional exploitation, and it often begins from a genuine place. A man gives because he cares, because he wants to show effort, or because he believes that proving his loyalty will create deeper connection. But when that giving becomes one-sided, excessive, or driven by insecurity, it stops being generosity and becomes self-betrayal. Many men don't realize that overgiving is not interpreted as kindness. It's interpreted as desperation. It signals that you're willing to do more than what's healthy just to maintain the relationship. And when a woman picks up on this imbalance, it shifts the dynamic immediately. She learns that he will keep giving even when she isn't matching that energy, and that realization is what allows exploitation to begin. A man who overgives often does so because he's trying to compensate for something he thinks he lacks. He may believe he's not handsome enough, not successful enough, not experienced enough, or not confident enough, so he uses effort as a substitute for self-worth. He goes out of his way to fix problems she hasn't asked him to fix, he sacrifices his time even when it's inconvenient, and he prioritizes her needs above his own as if that's the only way to stay relevant in her life. The more he gives, the more he trains her to expect that level of sacrifice. And once giving becomes routine, it turns into obligation. She stops appreciating the gesture because it becomes the baseline. Instead of gratitude, he receives expectation. Instead of reciprocity, he receives entitlement. And this is exactly how overgiving becomes the foundation for emotional exploitation. Women are not blind to emotional imbalance, they observe it quickly. When a woman realizes a man is pouring in effort without requiring anything in return, respect, consistency, clarity, or reciprocity, she learns that she doesn't have to do much to keep him invested. Some women use this awareness to secure emotional benefits without offering emotional depth. She will accept his favors, his time, his support, and his emotional labor, yet give the bare minimum in return. She may keep him around for validation, comfort, or attention, knowing he won't question the lack of balance because he fears losing her. Overgiving becomes the leash that keeps him in place, not because she holds real affection, but because she holds the power of knowing he will do whatever it takes to stay. Another consequence of overgiving is that it blocks a man from seeing a woman's true intentions. When he's investing more than she is, he becomes emotionally biased. He starts justifying her distance, her inconsistency, or her cold behavior because he's already too invested to pull back. He convinces himself that she'll eventually match his energy, that the relationship will improve, or that his effort will be recognized one day. But the longer he overgives, the deeper he sinks into a dynamic where his value is measured by how much he provides, not by who he is. And when a woman realizes she can receive his emotional labor without offering her own vulnerability, she becomes comfortable taking without giving. She may not even see him as a romantic partner, just a resource she can access whenever she needs emotional support or attention. Overgiving also creates an emotional environment where he loses his sense of self. Because he's so focused on pleasing her, he forgets to ask himself critical questions. Is this relationship healthy for me? Is my effort being appreciated? Is she meeting my needs in return? A man who overgives rarely asks these questions because he's too afraid of what the answers might be. He clings to the idea that effort will fix everything, but effort without boundaries is the fastest way to lose yourself in a relationship. And once a woman senses that he doesn't prioritize his own emotional well-being, she knows she doesn't have to prioritize it either. The truth is, overgiving doesn't create love. It creates leverage. It creates a one-sided relationship where the woman receives and the man depletes himself consistently. And that cycle continues until he realizes that love requires balance, not sacrifice, and that giving must be mutual to be meaningful. One of the biggest reasons men get emotionally exploited is because they fail to recognize the subtle signs that a woman is using their insecurities to gain control. These signs are rarely obvious in the beginning. They don't show up as clear red flags, but as small behaviors that gradually reveal her intention to maintain emotional power over him. A man who lacks awareness of his own value is more likely to ignore or minimize these signs because he thinks any attention, even inconsistent attention, is better than none. But women who understand emotional dynamics know exactly how to tap into a man's insecurities to keep him uncertain, invested, and longing for validation. And once this pattern begins, it becomes extremely difficult for him to break free from the cycle. One of the most common signs she's exploiting his insecurities is her strategic inconsistency. She becomes warm, affectionate, and attentive when she wants something, but distant and unavailable the moment he needs emotional support. This push and pull dynamic keeps him mentally and emotionally off balance. It feeds into his insecurity that he's never doing enough or that he has to work harder to maintain her interest. She learns that by giving him small doses of affection followed by withdrawal, she can keep him chasing her emotionally. This isn't love. It's emotional manipulation disguised as unpredictability. And a man who isn't confident in his own worth often mistakes this inconsistency for passion or mystery, when in reality it's a deliberate tactic to maintain control. Another sign is when she uses guilt to influence his behavior. She subtly makes him feel responsible for her emotions, her problems, or even her insecurities. If he tries to set boundaries, she reacts as if he's being selfish or uncaring. If he wants time for himself, she makes him feel like he's abandoning her. This emotional burden becomes a tool she uses to keep him compliant. Women who exploit insecurity understand that guilt is one of the most powerful ways to control someone who doesn't fully trust his own value. Instead of evaluating her behavior, he evaluates his own worth. Instead of noticing the imbalance, he fixates on what he could be doing better. This dynamic slowly conditions him to prioritize her emotional reactions over his own needs. She may also weaponize comparison directly or indirectly to reinforce his insecurity. She talks about how other men treat her, what other women receive in relationships, or what she believes a real man should be doing. These comments are not accidental, they are calculated. They tap into his desire to prove himself. They make him feel like he's never enough unless he meets the constantly shifting standards she sets. Women who use comparison as a tool know that insecure men will try to compete for validation, and that competition keeps them trapped in the cycle of overperforming for affection that should be mutual. Another subtle sign is when she only offers validation when it serves her goals. She might compliment him when she wants something or boost his confidence just enough to keep him emotionally tied to her. But the moment he starts showing independence, confidence, or emotional clarity, she withdraws that validation. She knows an insecure man relies on external affirmation, so she gives it sparingly to maintain influence. This selective reinforcement keeps him craving approval and doubting himself whenever she pulls away. The imbalance strengthens her position while weakening his emotional stability. A deeper sign, often missed by men, is how she reacts to his self-improvement. A woman who genuinely cares supports a man's growth, but a woman exploiting him feels threatened by it. If she sees him gaining confidence, setting boundaries, or recognizing his value, she may become irritable, distant, or critical. She senses that her control is slipping, and instead of celebrating his growth, she works to bring him back to the insecure version she can manipulate. She might question his motives, accuse him of changing, or imply that his growth is a problem. This is not love, it's an attempt to preserve the imbalance that benefits her. Recognizing these signs is not about blaming women, but about understanding patterns. A man's insecurity becomes a doorway for emotional exploitation only when he overlooks these behaviors and accepts them as normal. The more aware he becomes of these subtle tactics, the less likely he is to fall into relationships where his insecurities are used against him. Men who lack boundaries often have no idea how much this single trait shapes the entire dynamic of their relationships. Boundaries are not walls. They are guidelines that define what is acceptable and what is not. But when a man doesn't know his own value, he struggles to enforce even the simplest limits. He says yes when he wants to say no. He tolerates behavior that drains him, and he avoids uncomfortable conversations because he fears conflict or abandonment. This fear-based approach to relationships turns him into an emotional sponge, absorbing everything but expressing nothing. Women who notice this quickly realize that he can be molded to fit their needs, even at the cost of his own happiness. And this is how men without boundaries become magnets for draining, one-sided, and emotionally exhausting relationships. A man without boundaries often becomes excessively accommodating. He prioritizes her needs at the expense of his own well-being, sometimes without even realizing it. Whether she asks for emotional support at inconvenient times, expects financial help, or demands constant attention, he responds immediately because he fears that saying no might make him seem uncaring or unworthy. This pattern teaches her that he will always adjust himself for her comfort. Instead of earning respect, he ends up earning dependence, where she expects him to solve her emotional issues, handle her frustrations, and carry her burdens. And the more he complies, the more she pushes. Not because she's intentionally cruel, but because he has shown her that his boundaries are flexible or non-existent. Another way lack of boundaries attracts draining relationships is through the type of women he becomes involved with. Women who want equal partnership are drawn to men who stand firm, who communicate clearly, and who respect themselves. But women who desire control, intentionally or unintentionally, are drawn to men who are easy to influence. They thrive in environments where they can dictate the pace, the emotional tone, and the direction of the relationship. When a man can't say no, can't address disrespect, and can't walk away when necessary, he becomes the perfect partner for someone who wants emotional power. She knows he won't challenge her. She knows he'll accept excuses. She knows he'll rationalize her behavior even when it hurts him. This dynamic doesn't happen because she is inherently manipulative. It happens because he has shown her that there will be no consequences for crossing his limits. A man with weak boundaries also struggles to recognize emotional red flags. When a woman becomes inconsiderate, dismissive, or controlling, he explains it away. He tells himself she's just stressed, emotional, or misunderstood. He minimizes his own discomfort to maintain peace. But peace that comes from silence is not peace, it's avoidance. And avoidance gives toxic behavior room to grow. Over time, she learns that she can use emotional outbursts, silent treatment, guilt, or passive-aggressive comments to influence him. These behaviors drain him because he's constantly overthinking, trying to fix things he didn't break, and apologizing for things he didn't do. Without boundaries, he becomes responsible for maintaining her emotional stability, while she feels no responsibility toward his. Lack of boundaries also affects how he communicates. Instead of expressing needs clearly and confidently, he tiptoes around issues, afraid that honesty will create conflict. He hides his frustration, suppresses his disappointment, and pretends he's okay just to avoid upsetting her. This creates emotional exhaustion because he's constantly managing two realities, the one he lives internally and the one he shows externally, and this dual existence slowly destroys his self-esteem. A woman who benefits from this silence remains in control because he never challenges the emotional imbalance she creates. She continues taking because nothing stops her. He continues giving because he's afraid to stop. Finally, when a man lacks boundaries, he becomes predictable in his emotional patterns. She knows he will forgive easily. She knows he will chase after conflict. She knows he will fix things even if she caused them. Predictability creates comfort for her but exhaustion for him. And the more he tolerates, the more she tests. Not because she wants to hurt him, but because boundaries teach people how to treat us, and he has taught her that his needs, limits, and emotional well-being are negotiable. Validation seeking is one of the most dangerous emotional habits a man can have because it silently shifts the power dynamic in a relationship long before he even realizes what's happening. When a man doesn't believe in his own worth, he begins relying on a woman's approval to feel secure, confident, or valued. He looks to her reactions to determine his self-esteem. If she praises him, he feels worthy. If she withdraws, criticizes, or becomes distant, he collapses emotionally. This dependency makes him extremely vulnerable because it gives her the power to dictate how he feels about himself. Women who understand this, whether consciously or unconsciously, can use it to their advantage, creating a dynamic where he works endlessly for the tiniest bits of validation. And once she sees he relies on her approval more than his own self-belief, she knows she can take him for granted without fear of losing him. A man who seeks validation often begins by overanalyzing everything he does in the relationship. He worries about saying the wrong thing, doing too much, doing too little, texting too soon, or not texting enough. His actions are no longer driven by authenticity. They're driven by fear. He wants to impress her, not because it's part of natural connection, but because he believes her acceptance is what makes him desirable. This mindset becomes visible in his behavior. He apologizes even when he isn't wrong. He tries to fix problems that aren't his responsibility. He gives more love than he receives, hoping she'll reciprocate. Instead of showing confidence, he shows emotional dependency. And the moment she senses that he needs her approval to feel good about himself, she understands the power she holds. Women can quickly identify when a man is validation dependent. It shows in how he reacts to her attention. If one warm message from her lifts his entire mood and one cold response shatters it, she knows she can control the rhythm of his emotions simply by adjusting how much affection she displays. This allows her to build a dynamic where he becomes the chaser, constantly trying to win back the emotional warmth she selectively gives. She doesn't even need to say anything directly. Her behavior alone becomes the tool of influence. When she wants effort, she becomes affectionate. When she wants him to feel uncertain, she becomes distant. This push and pull dynamic thrives because he has attached his sense of worth to her approval. A man who seeks validation often loses his identity in the process. Instead of showing the world who he is, he becomes whoever he thinks she wants him to be. He changes his preferences, his behavior, his boundaries, even his values just to maintain her approval. This self-abandonment creates a version of himself that isn't grounded in confidence but in fear of losing her. And women rarely respect a man who abandons himself for connection. Even if she doesn't intentionally exploit him, the natural consequence is that she takes him for granted. When someone is always available, always agreeing, and always trying to please, the relationship stops feeling balanced. It becomes predictable, and emotional predictability leads to emotional detachment. Validation seeking also creates a cycle of emotional exhaustion. Because he relies on her reactions to feel good, any negative signal from her hits him deeply. A delayed response, a distracted tone, a minor disagreement, things that should be normal in a relationship, become triggers for anxiety. He begins questioning himself, doubting his worth, and overthinking every interaction. This emotional volatility makes him easier to manipulate because he is constantly trying to regain emotional balance through her approval. And a woman who recognizes this pattern may begin withholding affection as a way to maintain control. She doesn't have to raise her voice or make demands. All she has to do is become slightly distant, and he will work harder, give more, apologize faster, and lower his boundaries in hopes of regaining her warmth. Ultimately, validation seeking turns a relationship into a performance rather than a partnership. The man becomes the performer, always trying to meet invisible expectations, while the woman becomes the evaluator, offering approval only when it benefits her. This imbalance ensures he remains emotionally dependent, desperate for her attention, and constantly adjusting himself to avoid losing connection, even when the connection is draining him of his self-worth.